The porcelain cup shattered against the mahogany floor at precisely 11:47 a.m. on March 15, 1856. Steam rose from the spreading pool of amber liquid as Charles Beaumont clutched his throat, his face contorting into something unrecognizable. This moment would expose how far desperation could drive a woman who had nothing left to lose but her life. The French Quarter mansion at 217 Royal Street carried the weight of secrets in its wrought iron balconies and cypress shutters. Inside, the morning air hung thick with the scent of jasmine from the courtyard, the metallic tang of freshly polished silver, and something else, something bitter that lingered just beneath the sweetness of Earl Grey tea. Dinah Washington moved through these rooms like a shadow made flesh, her calloused hands smoothing bed linens and dusting furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. She had served the Beaumont family for 8 years, ever since arriving in New Orleans as part of the domestic staff trade that flourished along the Mississippi. Her small frame and quiet demeanor made her nearly invisible to the family she served, a quality that had kept her alive in a world where visibility often meant violence. Charles Beaumont owned 4 sugar plantations, 2 shipping companies, and a mansion that sprawled across an entire city block. At 42, he commanded respect from men twice his age, and fear from those who depended on his generosity. His wife, Eleanor, spent her days hosting garden parties and her evenings planning charity galas that raised funds for causes she never bothered to understand. Their 2 children, Margaret and Charles Jr., attended the finest schools money could provide, but money could not buy loyalty from those who had none. Police report, March 15, 1856. Subject complained of severe abdominal pain and difficulty swallowing. Victim deceased within 2 hours of onset. Dinah had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded Charles's fits of rage. The way his jaw tightened when reviewing plantation reports, how his fingers drummed against his desk when correspondence arrived from his business partners, the particular tone he used when addressing staff clipped, dismissive, dangerous. She had witnessed what happened to servants who spilled wine on his Persian rugs or served dinner 30 seconds past 8 o'clock. The Beaumont household maintained a strict hierarchy. Eleanor ruled the social calendar with an iron fan. Charles controlled everything else with methods that left no visible marks but plenty of invisible scars. The children absorbed these lessons about power and privilege with the casual indifference of those born to wealth, and Dinah watched it all from the periphery, collecting grievances like kindling. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in February when Charles discovered a silver candlestick missing from the dining room. He gathered the entire household staff in the main hall, 7 people who had served his family faithfully for years. Without investigation or evidence, he dismissed 3 of them on the spot, confiscating their few personal belongings as compensation for his missing property. Dinah found the candlestick 2 days later, forgotten behind a stack of books in Charles's private study. But the 3 dismissed servants had already disappeared into the maze of New Orleans streets, their references destroyed, their futures uncertain. Something shifted in Dinah's chest that day. The fear that had kept her compliant began transforming into something harder, more focused. She had learned patience in a household that demanded perfection. Now she would learn precision. The plan required weeks of careful observation. Charles took his morning tea at exactly 11:30, served in his late mother's Wedgwood china. He preferred it strong, with 2 lumps of sugar and a splash of cream from the family's prized Jersey cow. The ritual never varied, which made it perfect for her purposes. Arsenic was surprisingly easy to acquire in 1856 New Orleans. Rat poison sold at any apothecary, no questions asked. The white powder dissolved completely in hot liquid, leaving no trace of its presence except for a slight metallic aftertaste that most people attributed to poor quality tea leaves. But Dinah made a critical miscalculation. She assumed that mercy and justice were the same thing. The morning of March 15th began like any other. Eleanor departed early for her weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting. The children had already left for school. Charles remained in his study, reviewing shipping manifests while Dinah prepared his tea service in the kitchen below. Her hands remained steady as she measured the powder just enough to make him sick, she told herself. Just enough to humble him. Just enough to remind him that power had limits. She climbed the curved staircase with the silver tray, knocked twice on the study door, and entered when Charles granted permission. He barely glanced up from his papers as she arranged the china on the small table beside his leather chair. "Will there be anything else, sir?" "No. Close the door behind you." Dinah retreated to the hallway and waited. Through the thick oak door, she could hear the gentle clink of porcelain against porcelain, the soft sigh of satisfaction that always accompanied Charles's first sip of morning tea. Then silence. Too much silence. When the cup shattered and Charles began screaming, Dinah realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The white powder had been more potent than she anticipated, or perhaps desperation had made her hands less careful with measurement. But what happened next would prove that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and some witnesses too valuable to silence. Why did she remain in the house as Charles lay dying? What did she know about the Beaumont family that made running impossible? The answers would transform a simple poisoning into something far more sinister than anyone in New Orleans could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into Dinah's deadly gamble, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. Hit that like button if you're ready to uncover the dark truth about power, revenge, and the deadly cost of invisibility. And make sure you subscribe, because this story is just beginning. Blood pooled beneath Charles Beaumont's fingernails as he clawed at the Persian rug, his body convulsing with each labored breath. Dinah stood frozen in the doorway, watching her master die with the methodical precision of a clockwork toy winding down. This was the moment she discovered that murder changes the murderer more than the victim. The Beaumont mansion had always been a repository of secrets, but none as immediate as the one now writhing on the study floor. The house itself seemed to exhale around Dinah as she stepped back into the hallway, the familiar sounds of domestic routine continuing, below the cook preparing lunch, the gardener trimming hedges, the stable boy whistling as he fed the horses, life proceeding with blissful ignorance, while death claimed the master of the house 20 feet above their heads. Dinah's mind fractured into competing impulses. Every rational thought screamed at her to flee, to disappear into the labyrinth of New Orleans before Charles's body grew cold. But her feet remained planted on the mahogany floor, held in place by something stronger than fear. She knew things that made her too valuable to Charles's enemies and too dangerous to his friends. For 8 years, she had been invisible furniture in rooms where powerful men made terrible decisions. She had served brandy to politicians who sold votes like commodities. She had changed sheets stained with evidence of Charles's midnight visits to his business partner's wife. She had dusted the secret compartment in his desk where he kept detailed records of every bribe, every threat, every body buried beneath the foundation of his sugar empire. Coroner's note, March 16, 1856. Deceased exhibited classic symptoms of metallic poisoning. Arsenic suspected but not confirmed due to family objections to autopsy. The knowledge had accumulated gradually, like sediment in a riverbed. Individual incidents that seemed insignificant until viewed as part of a larger pattern. Charles Beaumont was not simply a wealthy plantation owner. He was the unofficial king of a criminal network that stretched from the Mississippi Delta to the Caribbean. And Dinah had been taking notes. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in her tiny servants' quarters, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from the humid New Orleans air, were 47 pages of meticulous documentation. Names, dates, amounts, locations. A complete ledger of Charles's criminal enterprises, written in the careful script of a woman who understood that information was the only currency that mattered to the powerless. She had never intended to use these records as blackmail. The notes began as a form of insurance, a way to protect herself if Charles ever decided that a housemaid knew too much for her own good. But they had evolved into something more dangerous, a weapon capable of destroying half the political establishment of Louisiana. Now, Charles lay dead, killed by her hand, and those 47 pages had become either her salvation or her death warrant. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones jolted Dinah back to the present. Through the study window, she watched Eleanor's familiar black brougham approaching the front entrance. The ladies' auxiliary meeting had ended early, which meant Eleanor would discover her husband's body within minutes. Dinah had perhaps 3 minutes to make a choice that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. She could run. The back servants' entrance led to an alley that connected to a dozen different escape routes. Her documentation was hidden but accessible. With the right buyer, those pages could fund a new life in Mexico or California, far beyond the reach of Charles's associates. Or she could stay and play a more dangerous game. The house whispered its secrets. Eleanor's footsteps echoed in the main hall below. "Charles? Charles, darling, I'm home." Her voice carried the artificial sweetness that wealthy women use to mask their indifference. In 30 seconds, she would climb the stairs to deliver news from her charity meeting. In 60 seconds, she would discover that her husband was beyond caring about social obligations. Dinah made her choice. She walked calmly to Charles's desk, opened the secret compartment with practiced efficiency, and removed 3 specific documents. The first detailed a shipment of human cargo scheduled to arrive from Cuba the following week. Not sugar, but people to be sold at a private auction in the warehouse district. The second contained the names of 7 city officials who received monthly payments to ignore certain import manifests. The third was a letter from Charles's business partner confirming the murder of a rival plantation owner the previous autumn. She folded the papers, tucked them inside her apron, and positioned herself at the top of the stairs just as Eleanor reached the landing. "Oh, Dinah, is Mr. Beaumont in his study? I have the most delicious gossip from the auxiliary meeting." "Yes, ma'am, but I think something might be wrong. I heard a terrible crash a few minutes ago, and he hasn't responded to my knocking." Eleanor's face shifted from social brightness to genuine concern. She rushed past Dinah toward the study, her silk skirts rustling like autumn leaves. The scream that followed shattered the afternoon silence and brought the entire household running. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Eleanor collapsed beside her husband's body, alternately sobbing and calling for help. The cook sent the stable boy racing for the doctor and the sheriff. Neighbors gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame, and Dinah played her role perfectly. The loyal servant devastated by her master's sudden death, helpful and cooperative with the authorities, appropriately tearful at the loss of such a generous employer. But beneath her mask of grief, she was calculating. The 3 documents in her apron represented enough evidence to hang half the city's power structure. Charles's death had created a vacuum that would soon be filled by men even more ruthless than he had been. Men who would pay handsomely to ensure that certain secrets remained buried with him. The sheriff, a tired man named Broussard, who owed his position to Charles's political influence, conducted a perfunctory investigation. No signs of forced entry. No obvious wounds on the body. The deceased had a known heart condition and had been under considerable stress from business difficulties. Death by natural causes. Case closed. What would you have done in Dinah's position? Would you have run? Or would you have recognized that sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight? Eleanor's tears were genuine, but they weren't for her husband. They were for the comfortable lie that had just died with him, and the uncertain future that awaited a widow who knew nothing about the source of her family's wealth. But Dinah knew everything, and knowledge, as she was about to discover, could be more dangerous than poison. Eleanor Beaumont discovered her first gray hair while staring at her reflection 3 days after the funeral, her trembling fingers tracing the silver strand like a countdown to her own mortality. The mirror revealed more than aging. It showed a woman who had lived 8 years as an ornament and now faced a world that devoured the unprepared. This was her introduction to a truth that Charles had shielded her from. Wealth without power was just elaborate poverty waiting to happen. The funeral parlor on Chartres Street reeked of lilies and formaldehyde, with undertones of the river mud that seeped through New Orleans' foundations like original sin. Mahogany caskets lined the walls like sleeping giants, their brass fixtures gleaming under gaslight that cast dancing shadows across the mourners' faces. Eleanor sat in the front pew, wearing black silk that cost more than most families earned in a month, accepting condolences from men who measured their grief in dollars and opportunity. She was drowning in sympathy and suffocating on lies. The lies began immediately after Charles's death, delivered by his business partners with the smooth efficiency of pallbearers lowering a coffin. The shipping company was experiencing temporary difficulties. The sugar plantations required immediate cash infusions to remain profitable. The various investments that had funded their lavish lifestyle were tied up in complex legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. In simpler terms, the money was gone, disappeared into ventures that existed only on paper, and schemes that died with their architect. Attorney's letter, March 20, 1856. Mrs. Beaumont must understand that her husband's estate carries significant debts. Liquidation may be necessary to satisfy creditors. Eleanor had never balanced a ledger or negotiated a contract. Charles had insisted that such matters were beneath a lady's concern, that her role was to grace his arm at social functions and produce heirs to carry on his legacy. She had accepted this arrangement with the naive contentment of someone who had never imagined that protection could vanish with a heartbeat. Now she faced a parade of creditors, lawyers, and business associates who spoke in coded language about obligations and expectations. They treated her with the patronizing kindness reserved for children and the mentally deficient, explaining complex financial arrangements with the patience of men who had already decided her fate. But Eleanor was not as helpless as she appeared. 8 years of marriage to Charles Beaumont had taught her to read the subtleties of male ambition. She recognized the hunger in their eyes, the calculations that preceded their offers of assistance. They were not mourning her husband, they were dissecting his corpse and fighting over the choicest pieces. The revelation came during a meeting with Charles's senior business partner, Marcus Thibodeau, in the study where her husband had died. Thibodeau was a man who wore expensive suits like armor and spoke in whispers that carried the weight of threats. He sat behind Charles's desk as if he already owned it, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface with proprietary confidence. "Eleanor, my dear, you must understand your position. Charles left you comfortable, but not independent. The house, the servants, the social standing, all of this requires capital to maintain. Capital that is currently unavailable." She watched his performance with growing clarity. The concerned friend, the reluctant bearer of bad news, the generous soul offering salvation with barely concealed conditions. It was masterful theater, but she had been watching similar performances her entire adult life. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" "A partnership of sorts. I would assume management of Charles's remaining assets, ensure the debts are properly handled, maintain your current lifestyle. In exchange, you would sign certain documents, transferring operational control of the properties to more experienced hands. Translation: surrender everything and become a pensioner in her own home." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his generous offer. But her mind was racing through possibilities that would have shocked her husband. Charles had always underestimated her intelligence, a mistake that had allowed her to observe his business practices without arousing suspicion. She knew about the warehouse where impossible things arrived on unmarked ships. She had overheard conversations about judges who ruled according to the weight of their bribes. She had seen Charles burn letters that contained names of political enemies who subsequently suffered mysterious accidents. But most importantly, she had noticed Dinah. The girl cleaned thoroughly. During their 8-year marriage, Eleanor had watched Dinah move through the house with systematic precision, dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting, organizing papers that seemed perfectly organized already. At the time, she had attributed this behavior to obsessive attention to detail. Now she suspected something else entirely. That evening, Eleanor found Dinah in the servants' quarters, mending a torn apron by candlelight. The girl looked up with the same mask of respectful concern that she had worn since Charles's death, but Eleanor caught something different in her expression, a flicker of intelligence that had been carefully hidden beneath years of submissive performance. "Dinah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer truthfully. Did you love my husband?" The question hung in the small room like smoke from a dying fire. Dinah's hands continued their methodical stitching, but her breathing changed slightly. "Ma'am, Mr. Beaumont was a good master. He provided—" "That's not what I asked." Eleanor's voice carried a new authority, one that surprised both women. "Did you love him?" Dinah set down her needle and met Eleanor's gaze directly. For the first time since entering the Beaumont household, she allowed her mask to slip. "No, ma'am, I did not." The honesty in those 4 words created a space for larger truths. Eleanor sat on the narrow bed beside Dinah, close enough to smell the lavender soap that all the servants used, close enough to see the calluses that marked a lifetime of hard labor. "Neither did I." Something shifted in the air. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes. 2 women who had spent years performing roles that no longer served them. Outside, the sounds of evening New Orleans filtered through the thin walls, merchants closing their shops, carriages rattling over cobblestones, the distant music from the taverns near the river. Eleanor spoke first. "Marcus Thibodeau wants me to sign over everything. He says Charles left us in debt." Mr. Charles kept papers in his desk. Secret papers. "I know. I saw him hide them sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention." Dinah hesitated, then made a decision that would change both their lives. "I know where they are. All of them." What Eleanor learned in the following hour would transform her from a grieving widow into something far more dangerous. But first, she would have to decide whether justice and survival could coexist in a world built on other people's pain. The secrets that Charles had died protecting were about to become weapons in the hands of 2 women who had nothing left to lose except each other. The hidden compartment yielded 47 pages that read like a blueprint for hell, each document more damning than the last. Eleanor spread them across Charles's desk while Dinah stood guard at the door, both women understanding that knowledge this dangerous could either save them or destroy them. This was the moment they learned that some partnerships are forged not in trust, but in mutual terror. The documents revealed a criminal empire that stretched beyond anything Eleanor had imagined during her years of willful ignorance. Charles hadn't simply owned sugar plantations. He had orchestrated a network that included human trafficking, political corruption, and murder-for-hire services that operated with the efficiency of any legitimate business. The papers contained shipping manifests for cargo that wasn't sugar, payment records to judges who ruled according to bribes rather than law, and correspondence that treated human lives as expendable commodities. One letter particularly chilled Eleanor's blood, a detailed discussion of eliminating a newspaper editor who had begun asking uncomfortable questions about mysterious disappearances in the warehouse district. The editor had drowned in the Mississippi 3 weeks later, his death ruled accidental by the same coroner who had declared Charles's poisoning a natural death. Business correspondence, February 8, 1856. The journalist problem has been resolved. River currents are most accommodating this time of year. Eleanor stared at her husband's elegant handwriting, recognizing the same careful penmanship that had signed love letters during their courtship. The man who had brought her flowers and quoted poetry had also ordered executions with the casual indifference of someone scheduling dinner appointments. But horror gave way to calculation as she absorbed the full scope of what these documents represented. Charles's criminal network couldn't simply vanish with his death. Too many powerful people depended on its continued operation. Someone would need to assume control, maintain the connections, ensure the profitable arrangements continued. Marcus Thibodeau was positioning himself as that successor. But he faced one significant problem. He didn't know about these documents. Without them, he was operating blind, unaware of the full extent of Charles's operations or the identities of key participants. The papers in Eleanor's hands represented a complete roadmap to power that Thibodeau desperately needed but couldn't access, which meant Eleanor held leverage she hadn't known existed. "Dinah," she said quietly, not looking up from the papers, "how long have you known about this?" "Since my second year in the house, ma'am. I started taking notes when I realized what I was seeing." Eleanor turned to study the young woman with new eyes. Dinah's calm demeanor suddenly made more sense. She hadn't been simply an observant servant. She had been conducting intelligence gathering with the methodical patience of a professional spy. "You could have used this information to blackmail Charles. Why didn't you?" "Because blackmail would have gotten me killed." Dinah's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood survival. Dead servants tell no tales, but they also collect no evidence. Mr. Charles needed me to be invisible, so I used that invisibility to protect myself. And now? Now Mr. Charles is dead, and being invisible won't protect either of us from what's coming. They were interrupted by the sound of carriages arriving in the courtyard below. Through the study window, Eleanor watched 3 black broughams discharge passengers onto the cobblestones. Marcus Thibodeau emerged from the first carriage, followed by 2 men Eleanor recognized as Charles's other business partners. The second carriage disgorged city officials whose presence at a private residence after 9 p.m. suggested urgency rather than social calls. The third carriage contained 4 men who were not introduced, but whose bearing suggested they specialized in violence. The meeting had arrived earlier than expected. Eleanor quickly gathered the most damaging documents, while Dinah restored the secret compartment to its original appearance. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the delegation reached the study. 2 minutes to decide how much of their hand to reveal. "Ma'am," Dinah whispered urgently, "they're not here to negotiate. They're here to eliminate problems." The implication struck Eleanor like cold water. If Marcus suspected that she possessed dangerous knowledge, tonight's meeting might be her last. A grieving widow suffering a fatal accident so soon after her husband's death would generate sympathy but little investigation, especially with the right officials already in attendance to expedite the paperwork. But Eleanor had spent 8 years observing how powerful men conducted business. The key was to demonstrate value before revealing vulnerability. The knock on the study door was perfunctory. Marcus didn't wait for permission before entering. He was followed by the other men, who arranged themselves around the room with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to intimidating conversations. "Eleanor, my dear, so sorry to intrude at such an hour, but we have urgent matters to discuss regarding Charles's affairs." She remained seated behind the desk, using her husband's chair as a throne that projected authority she was only beginning to understand. Dinah positioned herself near the fireplace, invisible again, but strategically placed to observe every face in the room. "Of course, Marcus, though I should mention that I've been reviewing some of Charles's papers this evening." Such fascinating business arrangements he maintained. The temperature in the room shifted perceptibly. Marcus's smile became strained, while his associates exchanged glances that communicated volumes. "Oh? Nothing too complex, I hope." Charles had a tendency to complicate simple matters. Eleanor opened the desk drawer and withdrew a single document. Not one of the most damaging, but significant enough to establish her position. It was a shipping manifest that listed Marcus as the recipient of a cargo shipment that officially didn't exist. This arrived from Havana last month. Curious that the Port Authority has no record of its contents being declared. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake, while the city officials suddenly found the wallpaper intensely interesting. The men who specialized in violence remained motionless, but their attention sharpened. Marcus cleared his throat carefully. "Eleanor, where exactly did you find this?" Charles was quite thorough in his record-keeping. It seems he documented everything. The word everything hung in the air like a threat. What Eleanor did next would determine whether she joined her husband in an early grave or claimed her place as the inheritor of his dark empire. She reached for a second document, one that contained names and dates that could destroy half the men in the room. But before revealing it, she needed to ensure that her newfound allies understood the rules of their deadly game. Because in New Orleans, some partnerships required blood to seal them. Eleanor placed the second document on the desk with the deliberate precision of a chess master positioning her queen for checkmate. The paper contained a list of 17 names, each followed by a monetary amount and a service rendered judges who had dismissed cases, port officials who had ignored suspicious cargo, police captains who had misfiled evidence. This was the moment she discovered that inheriting evil required embracing it completely or being destroyed by it. Marcus Thibodeau's composure cracked like thin ice under pressure. His eyes darted between the document and Eleanor's face, calculating odds that were rapidly shifting against him. The other men in the room recognized the shift in power dynamics. Some leaned forward with renewed interest. Others stepped back as if distancing themselves from an impending explosion. "Eleanor," Marcus said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of Charles's business relationships." "No misunderstanding at all." Eleanor's voice carried a calmness that surprised even her. "My husband was quite clear in his documentation. For instance, Judge Arsenic received $1,200 last October to dismiss the Patterson murder case. Captain Broussard has been paid monthly retainers since 1853 to ensure certain investigations reach favorable conclusions." She paused, letting the implications settle like poison in still water. "And you, Marcus, personally supervised the disposal of 3 bodies in the Barataria swamps between Christmas and New Year's Day." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the distant sound of steamboat whistles on the Mississippi River. Marcus's face had gone pale, while Judge Arsenic, one of the men Eleanor had recognized from the carriages, appeared to be having difficulty breathing. Captain Broussard, a heavy-set man with a graying beard, was the first to speak. "Mrs. Beaumont, these are serious accusations. I hope you understand the gravity." "I understand perfectly, Captain." Eleanor opened the desk drawer and withdrew a thick leather portfolio. Charles kept copies of everything: bank drafts, correspondence, even photographs from some of your more memorable transactions. The portfolio thudded onto the desk like a judge's gavel, final and unappealable. Personal journal entry: Charles Beaumont, January 3rd, 1856. 3 problems solved permanently. Broussard's methods remain efficient. Payment transferred as agreed. Dinah remained motionless by the fireplace, but Eleanor caught the slight nod that confirmed her suspicions. The girl had been more than an observer. She had been an archivist, carefully documenting 8 years of criminal activity with the patience of someone who understood that information was survival. Marcus attempted to regain control of the situation. "Eleanor, I can see that Charles involved you more deeply in his affairs than I realized. Perhaps we can discuss a more equitable arrangement. Perhaps we can." Eleanor leaned back in Charles's chair, feeling the weight of authority settling around her shoulders like inherited armor. "But first, We need to establish the new terms of operation." The transformation was remarkable. Minutes earlier, she had been a grieving widow facing financial ruin. Now she commanded a room full of men who specialized in violence and corruption. Her husband's blood still metaphorically wet on their hands. But power extracted its own price, and Eleanor was about to learn that some debts couldn't be paid with money. The negotiation that followed lasted until nearly 3 a.m. Eleanor discovered that Charles's criminal network generated approximately $15,000 monthly through various illegal enterprises, more than enough to maintain her lifestyle while expanding operations. But the business required constant attention, careful management of relationships, and occasional resolution of problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. The men in the room represented different aspects of this machinery. Marcus controlled shipping and distribution. Judge Arsenic ensured legal protection. Captain Broussard handled problems that required permanent solutions. The others managed warehouses, bribed officials, and recruited new participants in the growing enterprise. They needed Eleanor's cooperation to continue their operations, but they also needed assurance that she could handle the responsibilities that came with leadership. "Mrs. Beaumont," Judge Arsenic said during a break in negotiations, "running Charles's enterprises requires certain decisive actions. Are you prepared for what that might entail?" Eleanor looked around the room at these men who had served her husband faithfully and profitably. She thought about the comfortable life that awaited her if she simply signed their documents and accepted their protection. She thought about the alternative: poverty, social disgrace, and probable death once she became inconvenient. But mostly, she thought about Dinah, standing silently in the shadows, whose careful documentation had made this moment possible. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said finally, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my role in this arrangement." She stood and walked to the fireplace, where she retrieved a small wooden box from behind the coal scuttle. Inside were 7 more documents that Dinah had hidden earlier, each one containing information that could destroy the men in this room. "Knowledge kills when wielded correctly. You've been operating under the assumption that I need your protection to survive. But Charles's death has clarified something important. You need my silence to avoid the gallows." The box contained detailed records of murders, documented bribes, shipping manifests for human cargo, and correspondence that implicated political figures throughout Louisiana. Eleanor had inherited more than wealth. She had inherited the power to destroy or protect everyone in Charles's network. Marcus stood slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket, in a gesture that suggested violence was being considered. "I wouldn't," Eleanor said quietly. "Dinah, would you show our guests what happens to men who threaten me?" Dinah stepped forward and placed a loaded derringer on the desk. Charles's weapon, the one he had kept in his secret compartment for emergencies. "I've been practicing," Eleanor said with a smile that contained no warmth. Charles insisted that a lady should know how to protect herself. The room recalculated its dynamics once again. Eleanor was not simply a widow with dangerous information. She was a woman who had poisoned her husband and was prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened her newfound position. What happened next would determine whether New Orleans gained a new criminal leader or simply added another body to the Mississippi River. But Eleanor had already made her choice. She would not be another victim of men who treated women as disposable commodities. The Derringer's silver barrel caught the gaslight as Eleanor lifted it with steady hands, the weapon's weight surprisingly familiar after weeks of secret practice in the mansion's abandoned third-floor rooms. Marcus Thibodeau froze mid-reach, his hand suspended halfway to his jacket like a man caught between lightning and thunder. This was the moment Eleanor learned that respect and fear were often indistinguishable in the shadows of New Orleans. The confrontation stretched across several heartbeats, while each man in the room calculated his chances of survival against a woman who had already proven her willingness to kill. Judge Arsenault's breathing became labored. Captain Broussard's hand drifted toward his own weapon. and the 4 men who specialized in violence shifted their weight like predators preparing to spring. But Eleanor had spent 8 years studying the subtle choreography of masculine power, and she recognized something that her husband's associates had missed. They needed her alive more than she needed them breathing. "Gentlemen," she said, lowering the derringer but keeping it visible on the desk, "I believe we're approaching this negotiation from the wrong direction. You're treating me like a problem to be solved when I should be considered an asset to be cultivated." Marcus slowly lowered his hand, though his eyes remained fixed on the weapon. "What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor?" Charles built this network by understanding that power shared strategically is power multiplied. He never tried to control everything directly. He positioned himself as indispensable to everyone else's success. She moved around the desk with the fluid confidence of someone who had claimed her territory and intended to defend it. Dinah remained by the fireplace, but Eleanor noticed the girl's hand resting casually near the iron poker, another weapon should negotiations deteriorate further. The shipping operations continue under Marcus's supervision, but with modifications. We expand the human trafficking routes to include more profitable cargo from Central America. Judge Arsenic, your court will handle an increased caseload of property transfers and estate settlements, all legally documented, naturally. Captain Broussard, your services will be required more frequently as we eliminate competitors and consolidate territory. Eleanor opened the leather portfolio and withdrew a map of New Orleans marked with red ink. Charles identified 14 rival operations that have been cutting into our profits. By Christmas, I want them reduced to 7. By Easter, we should control everything between Canal Street and the French Quarter. Territory Expansion Plan, annotated by C. Beaumont, February 1856. Competition is waste. Monopoly is efficiency. The men exchanged glances that communicated years of shared violence and mutual profit. They were evaluating Eleanor's proposal not as moral agents, but as businessmen considering a potentially lucrative partnership with someone who had demonstrated both ruthlessness and intelligence. Judge Arsenic cleared his throat carefully. "Mrs. Beaumont, eliminating 14 operations would require substantial investment, both financial and otherwise. The financial resources are available." Charles maintained accounts in 3 different banks, plus investments in shipping companies that exist solely as laundering mechanisms. As for the other requirements, Eleanor's smile contained no warmth. "I believe we have adequate personnel for whatever measures become necessary." Captain Broussard leaned forward. "Ma'am, with respect, managing this kind of expansion requires hands-on oversight." Charles understood that leadership sometimes demands personal involvement in unpleasant tasks. Eleanor had anticipated this challenge. They were testing her commitment, trying to determine whether she possessed the stomach for the realities of criminal leadership. Charles had built loyalty through a combination of generosity and fear, but fear required demonstration. She walked to the window that overlooked the mansion's courtyard. Below, the stable boy was leading horses to their stalls, whistling a tune that drifted up through the humid night air. He was perhaps 16, with the kind of innocent enthusiasm that belonged to people who had never witnessed real evil. "Dinah," Eleanor said quietly, "please ask Thomas to join us in the study." The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Eleanor to catch her meaning, then nodded and left the room. The men watched this exchange with growing interest, sensing that Eleanor was about to provide the demonstration they required. Thomas arrived within minutes, still wearing his stable clothes and carrying the scent of horses and hay. He entered the study with the confused deference of a servant summoned to the presence of his betters, his eyes darting nervously between the assembled men. "Thomas," Eleanor said gently, "how long have you worked for the Beaumont family?" 3 years, ma'am. "Since I was 13. And have we treated you well?" "Yes, ma'am. Very well. You've been most generous." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, then picked up the derringer from the desk. Thomas's eyes widened, but he remained frozen in place by the paralyzing confusion of someone who couldn't process what was happening. Thomas, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news. We've discovered that someone in the household has been stealing from us. Someone who knows our routines, our schedules, our vulnerabilities. The boy's face went pale. Ma'am, I would never. I know, Thomas, you're innocent. But innocence doesn't protect you from suspicion, does it? The demonstration unfolded with terrible inevitability. Eleanor raised the weapon, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. The men in the room watched with the fascinated attention of predators observing a new member joining their pack. Thomas began to tremble, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his life was being measured against Eleanor's need to prove herself. But something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not mercy, something colder and more calculating. However, she said, lowering the gun, I believe in proportional responses. Thomas, you're dismissed from our service immediately. Dinah will provide you with wages for the next month and transportation to wherever you wish to go. I suggest you leave New Orleans and never return. The boy fled the room as if escaping a burning building. Eleanor turned back to the assembled men, who were staring at her with a mixture of disappointment and grudging respect. Gentlemen, that was your lesson in the difference between Charles's methods and mine. Charles ruled through fear and waste. He would have killed Thomas to prove a point. I rule through precision and calculation. Thomas alive and terrified in another city serves our purposes better than Thomas dead and forgotten in our cellar. She placed the derringer back on the desk with finality. Fear is a tool, not a goal. Dead men tell no tales, but living men spread the right stories to the right people. The room absorbed this philosophy with the careful attention of students learning from a master. Eleanor had not simply spared Thomas. She had transformed him into an unwitting agent who would carry stories of her ruthlessness to potential enemies throughout the region. But the real test still awaited, because New Orleans would not surrender its criminal territory without extracting blood payment from anyone bold enough to claim it. The first body appeared floating in the French Quarter Canal on April 3, 1856, bloated beyond recognition, but wearing the distinctive gold watch chain that identified him as Antoine Marchand, leader of the Tremé smuggling operation. His throat had been opened with surgical precision, then weighted with iron chains that had apparently loosened during decomposition. This marked the beginning of what New Orleans newspapers would later call the spring cleaning, though none dared print the name of its architect. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the morning fog roll off the Mississippi while Dinah delivered the daily intelligence report. 7 of the 14 targeted rival operations had ceased functioning over the past month, not through direct confrontation, but through the methodical elimination of key personnel, the strategic burning of warehouses, and the careful redistribution of their most profitable contracts. The transformation of Eleanor from grieving widow to criminal mastermind had required embracing lessons that no finishing school had ever taught. She learned that loyalty was purchased with equal measures of fear and reward. She discovered that violence, properly applied, was far more efficient than negotiation. Most importantly, she understood that power consolidated itself through the systematic removal of alternatives. The Rousseau brothers are requesting a meeting, Dinah reported, setting a silver tray of coffee on the writing desk. They wish to discuss terms for surrendering their dock operations. Eleanor sipped her coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that most New Orleans residents consumed while contemplating the strategic implications. The Rousseau operation controlled 3 prime loading docks that would complete her monopoly over river commerce. Their surrender would eliminate competition while adding infrastructure to her growing empire. But surrender negotiations could be traps, and Eleanor had learned to trust her survival instincts over her business interests. Intelligence report, April 4th, 1856. Rousseau meeting likely ambush. Recommend alternate location with controlled access points. Schedule the meeting for tomorrow evening. Not at their requested location. Use the warehouse on Chupatula Street. Ensure Captain Broussard positions his men appropriately. Dinah nodded, making notes in the leather journal that had replaced Charles's crude documentation system. Eleanor had insisted on more sophisticated record-keeping, understanding that successful criminal enterprises required the same organizational principles as legitimate businesses. The warehouse meeting that evening unfolded exactly as Eleanor had predicted. The Rousseau brothers arrived with twice the agreed-upon escort, their carriages positioned to block obvious escape routes, their body language suggesting men preparing for violence rather than negotiation. But Eleanor had spent months studying her husband's mistakes and learning from his tactical errors. Charles had relied too heavily on intimidation and not enough on preparation. He had survived through luck and brutality, rather than intelligence and planning. Eleanor arrived an hour early, with Captain Broussard's men already positioned throughout the building. When the Rousseau delegation entered the warehouse, they found themselves surrounded by armed men who had been waiting patiently in the shadows. The negotiation lasted exactly 7 minutes. Pierre Rousseau, the elder brother and nominal leader, attempted to salvage the situation through bluster and threats. He spoke of connections to political figures, alliances with other criminal organizations, and consequences that would follow if Eleanor continued her expansion. Eleanor listened politely until he finished, then nodded to Captain Broussard. The captain's response was immediate and permanent. Pierre Rousseau died before his younger brother could process what was happening. The other members of their delegation followed within seconds, their blood pooling on the warehouse floor, while Eleanor remained seated at the small table where she had intended to conduct civilized negotiations. "Clean this up," she instructed Broussard. "The usual method. And take possession of the dock facilities immediately. I want our people in place before anyone realizes there's been a change in management." The captain and his men moved with the efficiency of professionals who had performed similar tasks many times. Eleanor watched their work with a detached interest of someone observing any complex operation, noting areas where procedures could be improved for future reference. But as she walked back to her carriage, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in a broken window and paused. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the helpless widow who had discovered her husband's body 6 weeks earlier. Her eyes had acquired a hardness that seemed carved from stone. Her mouth held the slight downward curve of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. She had become something that would have terrified her former self. The transformation was complete, but the price was still being calculated. By summer's end, Eleanor controlled criminal operations throughout New Orleans with an efficiency that surpassed even Charles's achievements. Her network generated $23,000 monthly through diversified illegal enterprises, human trafficking, political corruption, protection schemes, and black market commerce that fed the appetites of a city built on sin and opportunity. But success attracted attention from competitors beyond Louisiana's borders. Other criminal organizations had taken notice of the power vacuum created by Charles's death and the subsequent consolidation under new management. They were beginning to probe Eleanor's defenses, testing her resolve through increasingly aggressive challenges. The most dangerous threat came from an unexpected source: Charles's own nephew, Robert Beaumont, who had arrived from Mobile with documents claiming inheritance rights to his uncle's legitimate properties. Robert was young, ambitious, and apparently unaware of the criminal enterprises that had actually generated the family wealth. His ignorance made him dangerous in ways that professional criminals were not. "Ma'am," Dinah reported during their evening briefing, "Mr. Robert has been asking questions about the warehouse operations. He's also requested access to his uncle's business records." Eleanor set down her brandy glass with deliberate care. Robert's inquiries represented a threat that couldn't be resolved through Captain Broussard's usual methods. Killing Charles's nephew would generate investigations that might expose the entire network, but allowing him to continue his research would eventually lead to discoveries that would be equally devastating. Some problems required more sophisticated solutions than violence. What Eleanor decided to do about Robert Beaumont would determine whether she retained control of her criminal empire or watched it collapse under the weight of family obligations and legal complications. The choice she made would also reveal how completely she had embraced the darkness that had consumed her husband, and whether any trace remained of the woman who had once believed in justice and mercy. Robert Beaumont's body was discovered in his hotel room on Dauphine Street 3 days before Christmas, 1856, his face frozen in an expression of surprise that suggested he had finally understood the true nature of his inheritance. The coroner found traces of strychnine in his coffee cup, though the official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by excessive drinking. This final elimination would cement Eleanor's reputation as the most dangerous woman in Louisiana, but it would also plant seeds that would grow into her eventual destruction. The hotel room at the Creole Arms carried the scent of death and expensive tobacco, its windows overlooking the narrow courtyard where merchants hawked their wares to tourists who came seeking authentic Southern hospitality. Robert had chosen the location for its proximity to the legal district, where he had spent his final weeks consulting with attorneys and clerks who specialized in inheritance disputes. His research had been methodical and dangerously thorough. When Eleanor and Dinah searched his belongings, they discovered a leather satchel containing copies of property deeds, shipping contracts, and correspondence that traced the connections between Charles's legitimate businesses and his criminal enterprises. Robert had been building a case that would have exposed the entire network while claiming his legal right to inherit everything. But Robert had made one crucial error. He had underestimated the woman who had already killed to protect her position. Eleanor stood beside his bed, studying the peaceful expression that death had arranged on his features. He looked younger in death, almost innocent, like someone who had never imagined that family loyalty could be purchased with poison. "Ma'am," Dinah said quietly, "he left letters. 3 of them, sealed and addressed to attorneys in Mobile. The letters represented a delayed action weapon that could destroy everything Eleanor had built. Even with Robert dead, his documentation would surface eventually, triggering investigations that might unravel the entire criminal network." Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. "Burn them," she said. "All of them. And destroy every document in this room." They worked quickly and efficiently, feeding papers into the hotel room's small fireplace until the air grew thick with smoke and ash. Eleanor watched 8 months of careful research disappear into flames, taking with it the last legitimate challenge to her authority. But as the final documents crumbled into cinders, Eleanor experienced something unexpected: regret. Not for Robert's death that had been necessary for survival, but for the woman she had been before Charles's murder, the one who might have found another solution. The realization came slowly, like poison working through her system. She had become everything she had once feared about her husband, and perhaps something worse. Charles had inherited his criminal empire from previous generations, accepting evil as a family tradition. Eleanor had chosen her path deliberately, transforming herself from victim to predator through conscious decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time. Final entry: Eleanor's private journal, December 28, 1856. "Power without conscience is merely sophisticated savagery. I fear I have become the monster I once married." The funeral was a masterpiece of social theater. Eleanor played the grieving widow who had lost her husband's only surviving relative, accepting condolences from the same people who secretly celebrated Robert's death. She wore black silk that cost more than most annual salaries, and wept tears that were genuine, though not for the reasons her audience assumed. She was mourning the death of her own innocence. By 1857, Eleanor Beaumont controlled the most sophisticated criminal organization in the American South. Her network stretched from New Orleans to Havana, generating wealth that exceeded the official budgets of several state governments. She had eliminated every major competitor, corrupted officials throughout Louisiana's government, and established business relationships with criminal organizations as far north as New York. But success bred its own dangers. Federal investigators had begun noticing patterns in shipping manifests that suggested organized smuggling operations. Rival criminals from other regions were forming alliances to challenge her monopoly. Most dangerous of all, some of her own associates were beginning to question whether a woman could maintain control over enterprises that traditionally required masculine violence. The challenge came from an unexpected source. Captain Broussard, the man who had eliminated so many of Eleanor's enemies, had decided that he deserved a larger share of the profits. He approached her during a routine business meeting with a proposal that sounded like negotiation but felt like extortion. "Mrs. Beaumont, I've been reconsidering our financial arrangements. My services have become increasingly valuable, and I believe my compensation should reflect that reality." Eleanor recognized the threat immediately. Broussard controlled the violence that protected her empire, but he also knew enough secrets to destroy her if their partnership soured. He was testing her resolve, trying to determine whether she would capitulate to his demands or risk the consequences of refusing. Her response was swift and final. "Captain, I appreciate your years of loyal service, which is why I'm offering you a choice. Accept a generous retirement package and relocate to a distant city where you can live comfortably on my continued gratitude, or remain in New Orleans and discover how easily replaceable you've become." Broussard smiled with the confidence of a man who believed himself indispensable. "Ma'am, with respect, you need me more than I need you, without my protection." Eleanor raised her hand, and Dinah stepped forward with a leather portfolio identical to the one that had established Eleanor's power over Charles's associates. "Captain, you've been a valuable employee, but you've never been irreplaceable." The portfolio contained detailed documentation of every murder Broussard had committed over the past 18 months, including witness statements, physical evidence, and correspondence that established his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Eleanor had been preparing for this moment since assuming control of the criminal network, understanding that loyalty purchased with money could be revoked with superior offers. Broussard's confidence evaporated as he realized the scope of his vulnerability. Eleanor possessed enough evidence to have him hanged 10 times over, and she had clearly been collecting it systematically throughout their partnership. He chose retirement, but his departure created a power vacuum that attracted attention from competitors who had been waiting for signs of weakness in Eleanor's organization. The final challenge would come from a source that no amount of planning could have anticipated: Dinah herself. The confrontation occurred on a foggy evening in March 1857, in the same study where Charles Beaumont had died almost exactly 1 year earlier. Eleanor was reviewing shipping manifests when she noticed something that made her blood turn cold. Dinah had been stealing from the organization not money, but information. She had been copying documents, maintaining her own records, building a complete intelligence file that could expose every aspect of Eleanor's criminal empire. "Dinah," Eleanor said quietly, "we need to discuss your future with this organization." The young woman looked up from her cleaning with the same mask of respectful attention that she had worn for almost 2 years. But Eleanor could see calculation behind her eyes, the patient intelligence of someone who had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. "Yes, ma'am?" Eleanor placed the evidence on the desk between them, copies of documents that should have existed in only one location, shipping manifests that contained notes in Dinah's careful handwriting, correspondence that had been photographed rather than simply filed. "You've been very thorough in your documentation, almost as thorough as you were with Charles's activities." Dinah abandoned her pretense of servitude with the smooth efficiency of someone removing an uncomfortable mask. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that Eleanor had never heard before. Mrs. Eleanor, I believe it's time we discuss the real nature of our partnership. What Eleanor learned in the following hour would shatter her understanding of everything that had happened since Charles's death and reveal that some games are played across generations by players whose patience exceeds human lifespans. The truth about Dinah's identity, her real reasons for entering the Beaumont household, and her ultimate plans for Eleanor's criminal empire would transform this story from a tale of individual revenge into something far more complex and terrifying. But that revelation would also seal Eleanor's fate, because some secrets are too dangerous to share and too valuable to die with their keepers. Eleanor Beaumont's empire would not survive the discovery that she had never been its true architect, only its most recent puppet. Even today, visitors to New Orleans report strange encounters in the French Quarter elegant women in 19th century dress who appear in reflections but cast no shadows, the scent of jasmine and arsenic that drifts from certain hotel rooms, and the persistent rumor that somewhere in the city's hidden archives, detailed records still exist of a criminal network that officially never existed at all. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.